She was attractive, self-assured, easy to speak to, and it appeared the feeling was mutual. There was an effortless chemistry between the two of them. So Dave decided to take a chance and asked Carrie out on a date, and she accepted. The date went well enough that afterwards Dave invited Carrie back to his apartment. Once there, Carrie made it clear that she also wasn't interested in a serious commitment. She explained that she simply wanted to keep things casual and enjoy herself. And this is exactly what Dave was looking for and wanted to hear. There was no pressure and no expectations between them, and over the following weeks, they agreed to continue seeing each other while keeping things uncomplicated. At that point in 2012, Carrie was 37 and employed as a computer programmer in Omaha. She lived in a small town, Macedonia, Iowa, roughly an hour away from Omaha, where she was raising her teenage son. By all appearances, Carrie had established a steady and stable life centered around her work and being a single mother. But things hadn't always been that way. In her late 20s, Carrie had been diagnosed with depression and later with bipolar disorder. She sought professional help and worked alongside therapists who prescribed medication to assist her. Like many individuals who deal with long-term mental health struggles, there were times when she stopped taking her medication because she felt that it left her emotionally numb. Even so, by the time she met Dave, everyone close to Carrie agreed that she seemed to be doing well in life. Those same people described Carrie as warm, charismatic, and engaging, with a memorable laugh and a bright smile. She was someone people noticed when she entered a room, and to those around her, her past mental health issues felt like they were far behind her. Which is exactly why accusing Nancy of being controlling and saying she had never been a good mother. Nancy also noted something that deeply unsettled her. The messages were sloppy, filled with spelling mistakes, missing punctuation and grammatical errors. But Carrie had always been extremely careful and precise in the way that she wrote. But these texts appeared disorganized and chaotic. Nancy repeatedly attempted to call her daughter, but none of the calls were answered, leaving her to fear that Carrie had suffered some sort of breakdown. Desperate to get Carrie help, Nancy searched for answers, but as the days passed, no one knew where Carrie actually was. She failed to attend her half-brother's wedding on November 16th, then she missed her son's 15th birthday, followed by Thanksgiving, and later her father's funeral. With each missed event, Nancy became more alarmed, eventually reporting Carrie missing and making sure authorities knew about her bipolar diagnosis and history with medication. Unfortunately, the response she received from police was far from reassuring. Because Carrie was still actively sending texts and emails, and because she was an adult known to have mental health issues, authorities didn't immediately view the situation as suspicious. From the outside, it appeared as though Carrie had voluntarily disappeared, while making her feelings towards everyone very clear. But despite Carrie's physical absence, the messages never stopped. Dave's phone almost never stayed silent for very long. Texts and emails arrived constantly at all hours of the day and night, sometimes dozens within a single day. The messages swung wildly between extremes, with Carrie telling him she hated him and wanted him to suffer, only later to insist that they were meant to be together. Meanwhile, Dave tried everything he could think of to stop the harassment. He blocked phone numbers and even changed his own number multiple times, but none of it made any difference. The messages somehow continued to reach him. In the middle of all of this, Dave also reconnected with Liz, a woman that he had previously met through online dating. Before Carrie entered the picture, Dave and Liz had maintained a casual relationship, and when Dave explained he was seeing other people, Liz hadn't objected. But as the harassment aimed at Dave and Nancy intensified, Liz eventually became another target of Carrie's anger. According to Liz, she began receiving threatening and hostile texts and emails from Carrie as well. There were even evenings when Liz and Dave would be sitting together on Dave's couch watching TV, only for both of their phones to start buzzing simultaneously. One particular message that unsettled Dave more than any of the others happened one evening when he was alone in his apartment, sitting back in his recliner with his feet up and just trying to chill, when suddenly a text appeared on his phone, describing exactly what he was doing at that very moment, including describing the blue shirt that he was wearing. At that instant, he realised the situation had gone far beyond simple emailed Dave a disturbing photograph showing a woman tied up inside a vehicle. The image was clearly graphic and unsettling, yet there was no explanation provided alongside it. Not long afterwards, Dave received another email from Carrie containing a website link that directed him to a fake online obituary created for Liz. And despite how terrifying all of this is, events would only get worse. In August of 2013, nearly a year after Dave and Carrie first met, Liz's home caught fire, tragically killing all of her pets. Even more disturbing, fire investigators concluded that the blaze appeared to have been intentionally started, and Liz became convinced that Carrie was the one responsible. Dave's workplace also became a target, as the auto repair shop where he worked was vandalized as well. Then in January of 2014, the harassment escalated again. Dave was in his apartment spending time with another woman when his phone suddenly began filling with messages once more. After the messages abruptly stopped, they heard someone attempt to open the front door, and moments later a brick came crashing through the window. Not long after that incident, Dave learned that Amy, the mother of his children, had also started receiving messages from Carrie. By this stage, Dave had become increasingly afraid for his own safety, so he purchased a gun and kept it in his apartment in hopes that it would offer him some protection and peace of mind. Later on, however, he realised the weapon had disappeared, prompting him to file a police report. Unfortunately, despite his suspicions, there was no obvious explanation as to where the gun had gone. Even after everything that had happened, the case would not officially be assigned to detectives Ryan and Jim until 2015. Neither detective had previously worked on Carrie's disappearance, but both were already familiar with the circumstances surrounding it, and together they decided to approach the case from two different angles. By then, it had been roughly 2.5 years since anyone had physically seen Carrie. Ryan chose to investigate under the assumption that Carrie herself was responsible for the harassment, whilst Jim explored the possibility that someone else had been impersonating her. One of Ryan's first steps was examining Carrie's financial records, and very quickly something stood out to him as deeply suspicious. Since 2012, which was 3 years earlier, there had been absolutely no activity on Carrie's bank accounts. If she had truly moved away to Kansas to begin a new life, it made no sense that she hadn't spent any money in all that time. Because so much of the case revolved around electronic communication, detectives next brought in a digital forensics specialist. Dave and Liz both agreed to allow investigators to examine their phones and online accounts, and what investigators discovered was staggering in scale. Over the course of 3 years, Dave alone had received approximately 15,000 emails and more than 50,000 text messages supposedly from Carrie. The tactics had evolved over time as well, with different platforms being used and locations masked in attempts to avoid detection. But even those efforts couldn't completely conceal the truth. So what was actually happening? Once investigators gained access to Liz's phone, they uncovered a photograph of Carrie's Ford Explorer that had been taken around a month before police officially discovered the vehicle in Omaha in January of 2013. Back when the Explorer had originally been searched, police recovered a single fingerprint from a mint container inside the vehicle that belonged neither to Carrie nor to anyone in the National Fingerprint database. Years using the 67 prefix to conceal the caller's identity. The threatening image of the bound woman that had been sent to Dave was also traced back to Liz's phone. Additionally, a video uploaded to YouTube under Carrie's name, showing someone walking around outside Dave's apartment, was connected to an IP address registered to Liz's home. There was also a furniture sale that ended up revealing another damning piece of evidence. Nancy explained to investigators that shortly after Carrie disappeared, she had received a text from Carrie claiming she had sold her furniture and asking Nancy to allow the buyer into the house to collect it. Carrie even sent a photograph of the check as proof that the sale had taken place, and the name written on that check was Shauna Collier, Liz's legal name. Piece by piece, investigators began assembling a picture that clearly demonstrated Carrie had not been responsible for the years of harassment at all. It had been Liz the entire time. She had sent every threatening message, vandalized her own house, and even started the fire in her own home that killed her pets. As investigators closed in on her, Liz began taking increasingly desperate actions during what would become her final period of freedom. In December of 2015, Liz walked into the sheriff's office claiming she wanted to file a harassment complaint against Amy, the mother of Dave's children. Liz alleged that Amy, not Carrie, had actually been behind all the messages from the very beginning, and she even implied that Amy might possess Dave's missing gun. The following day, Liz called 911 claiming she had been shot in the leg and believed Amy was responsible. Thankfully, investigators quickly uncovered what really happened. Liz had shot herself using the gun stolen from Dave's apartment in an effort to redirect suspicion elsewhere. As a result, police took another detailed look through Liz's phone, and this second examination uncovered even more evidence. Detectives discovered that Liz had created dozens of fake email accounts, many using different variations of Carrie's name. Investigators also learned that Liz had been using an application capable of scheduling text messages and emails to be sent automatically later on, explaining how Dave and Liz could both receive harassing messages at exactly the same time. This discovery also explained why the harassment never truly stopped, and showed just how much effort Liz had devoted to sustaining the deception. Detectives estimated that Liz may have spent between 40 and 50 hours a week maintaining this elaborate illusion. Armed with all this new evidence, Ryan and Jim intensified pressure on Liz in hopes of securing a confession. But somehow the case became even stranger. Suddenly, police began receiving emails from someone pretending to be Amy, confessing to murdering Carrie inside her vehicle back in 2012. Investigators eventually determined that those emails were also coming from Liz, and that revelation prompted police to search Carrie's vehicle once again. This time, investigators removed the upholstery from the passenger seat, and underneath they discovered bloodstains belonging to Carrie. In 2016, Liz was arrested and formally charged with sisters were raised in Woodland Park, Colorado, around 20 miles northwest of Colorado Springs, and only a few miles west of the U.S. Air Force Academy. With a population of fewer than 8,000 residents, Woodland Park was a close-knit community surrounded by over 1 million acres of Pike National Forest. According to most accounts, Josh and his siblings enjoyed an almost ideal childhood until their parents separated, after which Josh and his sisters, Ruth and Kate, moved in with their father, Mike. By his teenage years, Josh had grown into a tall, long-haired young man who was generally well-liked by nearly everyone who knew him. People often described him as a free spirit, but also as a good student and a gifted musician with a quick wit and a spontaneous sense of humour. On the surface, Josh seemed happy, hard-working and carefree, but beneath that exterior, he may have been carrying far more emotional pain and inner turmoil than anyone realised when he disappeared in 2008. Because of this, Josh's older sister Kate didn't immediately think much of it when he walked out of the family home on May 8th. After all, Josh loved nature, and Kate had long believed that the extended walks he frequently took through the forests surrounding Woodland Park were his own form of self-therapy. Up to that point, Josh had always returned home within a few hours, so at first there wasn't a lot of concern when he hadn't come back by sundown. And then the night passed and he still hadn't returned. By the time his father and sisters went to bed and later woke up the following morning, Josh's bed remained untouched. At that point, he had been gone for most of the previous day and the entire night, and his father and sisters started wondering whether something might be wrong. Even then, they initially believed he may have simply decided to camp out alone in the woods or stay overnight at a friend's house without telling anyone. But as more days passed without any sign of him, the family began calling his friends, checking the places he was known to visit, and searching local homeless shelters in case he had experienced some sort of emotional breakdown. Unfortunately, after several days of searching, there was still absolutely no trace of Josh. As a result, on May 13th, 5 days after Josh vanished, his father officially filed a missing persons report with the local police. At first glance, waiting nearly a week to report someone missing may seem unusual, but ever since the death of Josh's older brother 2 years earlier, the family had come to understand that things were different for all of them emotionally. It wasn't uncommon for members of the family to want to isolate themselves for periods of time. Both official and unofficial searches were carried out in and around Woodland Park. Yet, after 2 weeks, not a single clue regarding Josh's whereabouts had surfaced. During that time, the local police department faced criticism for appearing to treat the case too casually. However, Josh was legally an adult, and in the absence of evidence suggesting foul play, disappearing on one's own wasn't considered a crime. Meanwhile, Josh's family continued holding on to hope that one day they would wake up and simply find him back home asleep in his bed. His older sister Kate especially couldn't stop worrying about him. At the same time though, certain conversations she had shared with Josh before his disappearance gave her reason to believe he could still be alive and doing okay. Josh had told Kate more than once that he believed he was destined for some kind of great adventure, and that he might need to disappear for a while in order for it to happen. Because of this, Kate also considered the possibility that he had joined a new band and gone off on tour with them. Others close to him wondered if he simply could no longer cope with the painful memories tied to Woodland Park, and decided the only solution was to start over somewhere new entirely. No matter where Josh might have been, Kate hoped he would eventually return years later with a wife and children, always dismissed. Rumours claimed that many of his customers included local police officers and members of the legal community who worked to keep him out of trouble. Years later, in order to prevent the ranch's history and the identities of those connected to it from becoming public knowledge, the new owner, Chuck Murphy, constructed a cabin surrounded by pine trees on the property, where his brother lived until 2005. After that, Chuck began using the cabin as little more than a storage shed. Without regular maintenance, however, the structure gradually fell into serious disrepair. Then, in 2015, with property values increasing, Chuck decided to demolish the cabin so the land could be redeveloped into several dozen full-sized homes. At 80 years old, Chuck had no intention of handling the demolition himself, so he hired a local crew to do the work for him. The crew arrived one day with an excavator, and the demolition quickly got underway. But the situation quickly changed when workers spotted something inside an exposed portion of the chimney. Chuck immediately began waving frantically to stop the excavator operator before climbing through the debris for a closer look. To his horror, he discovered what appeared to be a decomposed body, curled in the fetal position and wearing nothing except a thermal t-shirt. Even more disturbing was the position of the remains, which suggested that whoever the person was had tried to crawl head first down the chimney. Chuck immediately contacted the police, who arrived shortly afterwards along with the county coroner. Although the body found inside the chimney was heavily mummified, once it was transported to the coroner's office for examination, dental records were used to confirm that it was Josh Maddox. By that point, several years had passed since his disappearance, and nearly a decade had gone by since the death of his brother, making the situation especially devastating for his family. While finally locating Josh may have brought some level of closure, the strange circumstances surrounding his death left many unanswered questions. After the initial shock faded, Kate speculated that Josh may have simply allowed his curiosity to override caution. Perhaps he had been searching for a quiet place to think and ended up in an unexpected situation. Whatever the case, the theory suggested that Josh misjudged the dimensions of the chimney, became trapped, and ultimately died there. However, some members of the local community found it unusual that the cabin had never been searched, despite being located less than a mile from Josh's home. Chuck, in particular, found it strange that anyone could have entered the chimney at all, since he had installed a heavy-duty rebar mesh cap decades earlier specifically to keep animals such as squirrels and raccoons out. The official coroner's report described Josh as being found in a fetal position, with his head positioned below his torso and legs. This indicated that he must have entered head first from the roof of the cabin, since the chimney was too narrow for him to turn around once inside. The report also noted that he was naked except for a thermal shirt, and that his hips had been dislocated from their sockets. Importantly, there were no signs of trauma, such as gunshot wounds or stab injuries. None of his bones were broken, and toxicology results showed no presence of drugs in his system at the time of death. The coroner ultimately concluded that Josh likely died as a result of hypothermia or dehydration, classifying the death as accidental. Regardless of the exact cause, being trapped upside down in such a confined space would almost certainly have made for a slow and distressing final experience, however long it lasted. On the surface, the coroner's findings appeared to resolve the mystery completely. However, not everyone accepted the conclusion as straightforward. Following the ruling, Chuck This action was clearly intentional, raising questions about who had done it and why. The positioning of Josh's body also added to the confusion. It was unclear why anyone would attempt to descend a narrow chimney head first. Entering feet first would have made more sense, as it would have allowed for a safer landing at the bottom. Adding to the controversy, the coroner later stated off the record that positioning the body in such a way likely would have required the involvement of at least 2 people. Another unusual detail involved the thermal shirt Josh was wearing, which on its own was not strange, except that the rest of his clothing was discovered inside the cabin, neatly folded near the fireplace. This raised the possibility that Josh either had been inside the cabin beforehand and folded his own clothes, or that someone else had done it for him. In light of these inconsistencies, the coroner even considered revising the original ruling. However, he ultimately maintained the accidental death conclusion due to a lack of definitive evidence beyond speculation. Over time, police and the coroner's office received numerous tips following Josh's disappearance and later discovery. Although tips continued to come in long after his body was found, public attention eventually faded and authorities largely concluded that foul play was unlikely. Most of the tips were dismissed until one name appeared repeatedly. A man initially identified only as Andy in several reports was later confirmed to be Andrew Richard Newman. Like Josh, he was known locally as a friendly, well-liked musician from Woodland Park. Whilst they weren't close during high school, people who knew them said that they were similar in personality and reportedly became friends after graduation. The unusual aspect of this connection was that Andy later left the area and went on to commit a multi-state crime spree. At the time Josh's body was discovered, Andy was already serving a prison sentence in Texas. He had previously been incarcerated in both Oregon and Washington as well. However, an incident that took place in northern New Mexico raised further doubts about the circumstances of Josh's death. According to reports, Andy once visited a home shared by a caretaker and a disabled man. It's unclear whether alcohol or drugs were involved, but the caretaker reported she consistently dreamed of becoming a teacher, but that path shifted after she fell in love. She had long been close with her friend Amber, though only in a platonic way at first. They had known each other since elementary school, and Caitlin was devastated when Amber's family relocated to Arizona. Fortunately, they stayed in contact after the move, and over time their friendship gradually developed into a romantic relationship. It wasn't something casual or short-lived. The two were deeply in love to the point where they eventually became engaged. In September of 2014, Caitlin made the major decision to leave her home in Virginia and move out west. She didn't want to be apart from Amber anymore. Together they settled in Lake Havasu City and even enrolled in the same cosmetology program. Even after leaving Virginia, Caitlin remained closely connected to her family, frequently checking in, especially after her sister became pregnant. She made a promise to be there for the birth of the baby. When the child was born in December of 2015, Caitlin flew back to Virginia as planned. During her visit, she spent time with relatives and old friends from December 1st through to December 5th. The last time anyone in her family saw her was on that Saturday, the day she was scheduled to fly back home. That morning, Caitlin appeared completely normal to her family. Her only concern was how to get to the airport. She first asked her mother for a ride, but her mum was scheduled to go to work and couldn't take her. Instead, her mum asked around for help and eventually thought of her ex-husband. Her mother and stepfather had separated years earlier, but he had still remained a father figure in Caitlin's life, and overall the relationship between her mum and stepdad was civil. So she asked him if he could take Caitlin to the airport, and he agreed without issue, explaining that his shift didn't start until 3 p.m, so he could easily drop her off. And if anything, it gave them a chance to briefly catch up. Caitlin was picked up and brought to his home shortly after. According to him, he was happy to see her. She appeared completely normal, and he asked her about school and her plans. Nothing about her demeanour suggested anything was wrong or troubling her. Then, just before 2 p.m, her stepfather says Caitlin asked to be dropped off at a nearby mall, only a couple of bus stops from the airport. She said she wanted to pass time before her 5:40 p.m. flight. He agreed and dropped her off, later texting her mother to explain the change of plans. Her mother found this slightly odd. As far as she knew, Caitlin didn't usually use the bus system, but still it made sense that she might prefer to shop rather than wait at the airport for hours. Less than 10 minutes later, her mother received another message. This one appeared to be from Caitlin, saying she was already at the airport, her battery was low, and she wouldn't be able to text for a while. This directly contradicted what she had told Amber earlier. Just hours before, Caitlin had messaged Amber saying that something had come up, and she wouldn't be returning on Saturday. She also told Amber that she wouldn't be able to text for a while, but would update her once she booked another flight. Amber was understandably alarmed by this message, although she didn't initially inform Caitlin's mother because she didn't realise they were receiving conflicting updates. Later that evening, Caitlin's mother received 2 additional messages. The first said that Caitlin was staying with a friend, and the second said that she needed time alone. By this point, her mother was certain something was seriously wrong. She knew her daughter with no further discoveries, speculation began to grow about what might have happened. Some people suggested that her ex-stepfather may have been involved in her disappearance. He was, after all, the last person to see her. Over time, investigators were able to track where both his and Caitlin's phone activity had been that day, and interestingly, it did not match his account. When Caitlin told her mother she was at the airport, her phone was actually pinging from a cell tower miles away. Her stepfather's message claiming he had dropped her off was instead linked to a location near his home. Later, when Caitlin sent the message saying she needed time to be alone, her phone was located roughly 15 miles from where her luggage was later found. At this point, it's important to note that the following theory is only speculative. One of Caitlin's friends claimed she felt uncomfortable around her ex-stepfather and, in her words, flat out didn't trust him. The same friend also suggested the relationship between them may have been verbally hostile and possibly even physical at times. However, there's no conclusive evidence linking her stepfather to Caitlin's disappearance, and she never filed any formal charges against him while they were living together. The other major theory is that Caitlin may have run away, potentially with help from her ex-stepfather. This idea is partly based on a separate series of messages between Caitlin and a friend. In those messages, she reportedly confided that something had happened the Friday before she left. She said she had been out partying with a female friend that night who brought her boyfriend along. The three of them had been drinking, and at some point the man allegedly made advances towards her, with the situation escalating further. Caitlin was said to be deeply shaken and overwhelmed